thank you all for joining us back for session 2 of Artists Workshop Practice in the Renaissance. This session will be devoted to training practices and absorption of training. And my name is Aoife Brady. I am the curator of Italian and Spanish art at the National Gallery of Ireland, and delighted to be here with you this afternoon. Our first speaker of the afternoon is Daniel Wallace Mays, who is the Associate Professor of Renaissance Art at the University of Iowa. Daniel grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan and majored in philosophy at Williams College in Massachusetts, and he completed his master's and PhD in the history of Renaissance art at UCLA in 2013. He has served a long list of long-term fellowships, including a Samuel H. Kress pre-doctoral fellowship here at the Kunsthistorisch Institute in Florence, and many more, including those at the Huntington Library and the University of York. And his book, Young Bellini, published in 2021 by Yale University Press, is, in his words, a radical revisionist history of the early life and career of Giovanni Bellini, who, again, in Daniel's words, is generally regarded as the greatest artist of 15th century Venice. So I will let the Quattrocento specialists among you argue about that later. But please join me now in welcoming Daniel, who will speak to us today about Giovanni Bellini's use of Jacopo Bellini's drawing books.
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me to the conference. Especially, I'd like to thank Shell. And let's begin. Okay. The 15th century Venetian artist Jacopo Bellini created two renowned drawing books that stand as significant contributions to the Italian Renaissance. His earlier book, produced over a period of about 25 years, from circa 1430 to circa 1455, showcases drawings in silver point with pen and brown ink on vellum and is currently owned by the Louvre. And I'm just here looking at the book, you can get a sense of the size of the book from this photo. His later book, oops, tricky, executed from circa 1455 until Jacopo's death in 1470 or 1471, features drawings on paper, primarily in lead point, and is owned by the British Museum. The dating of these books derives from the scholarship of German art historians Degenhardt and Schmidt, whose analysis, though not universally accepted, offers a compelling chronology of Jacopo's drawings. My paper today explores how the versatile compositions of some of Jacopo's drawings entered into Venetian art, not principally through Jacopo's own paintings, I will argue, but rather through the work of Giovanni Bellini, Jacopo's biological half-brother, whom Jacopo raised as his son. And if you are not aware that Giovanni is Jacopo's biological half-brother, you might want to read my book, Young Bellini, and there's a recent review of it by Sylvia Tita from Michigan State University, in studies in iconography that's quite insightful, and I link to it on my Academia EDU page. So the approximately 192 pages of multi-purpose drawings in Jacopo's two books encapsulate an array of themes. Jacopo explored religious and fantastical subjects set within country vistas and urban streets. He reproduced antique monuments and recorded inscriptions, presumably for later possible use. He practiced architectonic forms and sought the secrets of drawing in scientifically accurate linear perspective. And here I'm just showing the transversals on the drawing on the left. The left diagram is a cross section, and you can see they're not spaced evenly. That's from the Paris book. The right image is correct. And Jacopo elaborated upon the work not only of earlier artists, such as Altichiero, but also of contemporary ones, such as Donatello. Jacopo's drawing books, especially the earlier Louvre album, bridge artistic design from the late Middle Ages to the early Renaissance, and thus uniquely reflect a pivotal transition in the history of Western art. And indeed, several of Jacopo's drawings foreshadowed the emergence of later artistic trends. For instance, his drawing after Donatello's St. John the Baptist, executed around 1438, anticipates Renaissance altarpieces by several years. His mythological drawings seem to prefigure art inspired by the humanism that would flourish in northern Italian courts during the later 15th and 16th centuries. These and other examples prompt the question of whether the graphic ideas in Jacopo's drawing books actively helped shape the trajectory of Venetian art, or instead played a more passive, relatively detached role in artistic developments in northern Italy. Now, in his workshop in the Venetian parish of San Gimignano, Jacopo trained Giovanni Bellini. Jacopo also trained his own son, Gentile Bellini, and his nephew, Leonardo Bellini. But Jacopo's drawings would come to serve first and foremost Giovanni. Giovanni Bellini's St. Jerome in the Desert of circa 1450 demonstrates how the artist of about age 25 employed several of Jacopo's Paris drawings. Giovanni's compositional point of departure must have been Jacopo's drawing of the same subject in the Paris book. The Golden Legend quotes a letter in which Jerome described himself as a hermit in the, quote, vast solitude of the wilderness, my fleshless bones hardly holding together, scraped against the bare ground. All the company I had was scorpions and wild beasts. Jacopo littered the wilderness with real and fanciful beasts and corpses strewn across the shore, while at the same time alluding to a lost pagan antiquity represented by a nearby ruined column and a distant pedestaled classical statue. Giovanni loosely borrowed Jacopo's composition, but rejected many of Jacopo's visual ideas. Instead, Giovanni visualized a sacred landscape in which selected motifs economically recall pivotal events from the saint's life. The cave where Jerome lived in Chalcis, the Bible he would translate into Latin, the infirm lion that would wander into Jerome's monastery in Bethlehem, and the ass that the lion would later protect as a daily chore. And as is well known, Giovanni directly copied one of the lions from a page full of lions in Jacopo's Paris drawing book. Giovanni's use of Jacopo's Paris drawing book continued throughout the 1450s and can be seen as well in the Marcello manuscript illuminations sent to Giovanni Cosa and Duke René I in 1453. To execute the miniature of St. Maurice, Giovanni borrowed the stance, gesture, and overall figure of a drawing of King David conquering Goliath from Jacopo's Paris book. Giovanni transformed David's right hand clutching the decapitated giant's head and his left grasping a sword into Maurice holding a long spear in one hand and steadying a shield and palm branch with the other. Giovanni's direct use of Jacopo's drawing of David is particularly apparent in the midsection, where both David and Maurice shift their right hips to create a jog in the waist that appears to crease their cuirasses, which are drawn in a distinctive U-shaped cut with the same placement of the navel. Giovanni adapted other drawings from the Paris book to construct Maurice's unique armor. The design for his eccentric headgear with winged ears and spiny scales over the scalp must derive from the feathery winged ears of one of Jacopo's fictive soldiers and the spiny headgear of the other. The mollusk whorls and ray fins decorating the spaulders that cover the shoulders of one of Jacopo's soldiers and the cutter that protects his elbow become the spiral and wings on Maurice's paulins that shield the saint's knees. Giovanni's Maurice is therefore a thoughtfully constructed pastiche of motifs from 3 or 4 pages of Jacopo's Paris drawing book. From the mid-1450s, Giovanni also began to use Jacopo's London drawing book. Giovanni's Agony in the Garden of circa 1459 employed 2 sketches from Jacopo's London sketchbook as models and perhaps points of departure. These examples are well known. And demonstrate how Giovanni continued to use Jacopo's drawings as points of departure for specific motifs and details, but less explored by scholars, however, is Giovanni's continued use of Jacopo's drawings after Jacopo's death in 1470 or 1471. For instance, in circa 1475, Giovanni, at about age 50, executed his famous Pesaro altarpiece. The 2 leftmost predella scenes, St. George killing the dragon and the conversion of St. Paul, feature horses, animals Giovanni had previously painted only rarely and usually at a distance, such as in his Correr Crucifixion. Jacopo, on the other hand, had been particularly adept at illustrating horses, and his drawing books are replete with images of equines in a range of poses. Giovanni's point of departure for his St. George killing the dragon appears to have been a drawing of the same subject in Jacopo's Paris drawing book. Both images feature a background castle, midground princess, rearing horse, impaled hissing dragon, and discarded broken lance, as well as some skull and bones and bone remains. A second drawing in the Paris book of the same subject, when reversed, seems to have supplied Giovanni with a direct model for the rearing horse, bearing its teeth, set against a rocky outcrop. In Giovanni's conversion of St. Paul, the horse on the far left appears directly based on the reverse image of a different drawing of St. George and the Dragon from Jacopo's Paris drawing book, for its rearing chest, twisting throat, oblique muzzle, bared teeth, and skyward glance, as well as its reins, cheek piece, and throat latch. For the central horse in the conversion of St. Paul, Giovanni appears to have copied and then altered the reverse image of yet a different horse in Jacopo's Paris book. Note Giovanni's placement of the horse's rearing forearms and the distinctive musculature shading running parallel to the cleft of the horse's buttocks. Giovanni surely owes much to Jacopo's drawings for the lively portrayal of horses in the Pesaro altarpiece. Giovanni's nativity scene in the same predella probably took as its point of departure a drawing of the Adoration of the Magi from Jacopo's London book. The borrowed idea here is that the architecture emerges from the right at an oblique angle. The Holy Family is placed before it. Giovanni has elegantly tucked away the ox and ass. And the remainder of the image may then be devoted to the background, with Giovanni transforming the crowded and winding procession into an isolated path meandering past lush hills to distant mountains. Giovanni's predella image of St. Jerome on his knees and peering into a cave seems inspired by a drawing of the same subject in Jacopo's London book. Thus, it would seem that much of the predella of Giovanni's famous Pesaro altarpiece directly employed Jacopo's drawings as models and points of departure. Now, Jacopo Bellini had been deceased about 30 years when Giovanni executed 4 small panels, his so-called 4 allegories, for a Rossella, which was a highly decorated framed mirror with hooks for combs, brushes, and other cosmetic items. This is a possible recreation. By then, Jacopo's Paris drawing book was no longer in Venice, but presumably at the Ottoman court, having been given to Sultan Mehmet in 1479 by Gentile Bellini as a diplomatic gift. Susanna Rutherglen, who has published extensively on ornamental paintings for furniture in Renaissance Venice, wrote that, quote, Bellini's Bacchus panel anticipates some of the first examples of full-fledged classical mythological narrative in Venetian painting, including later work by Bellini himself, Dasso Dassi, and Titian for Alfonso d'Este's Camerino d'Alabastro in Ferrara, and even Titian's Poesie for King Philip II of Spain. But much here is indeed inspired by Jacopo's ideas executed decades earlier. Giovanni's mostly nude Bacchus, wearing a cape and a garland adorned with grapes and holding a bowl of fruit, appears to derive from a drawing in Jacopo's London sketchbook. Jacopo's horse is exchanged for Putti, who pull the chariot. The horse's rider becomes a nude soldier, turning back to gaze at the god of wine. Thus, when confronted with portraying unfamiliar iconographies, Giovanni, even in his mid-60s, continued to be inspired by Jacopo's London drawing book. Now, one of the most breathtaking and unusual features of Giovanni's stunning image of the assassination of St. Peter Martyr is its dense thicket of trees. On the left, St. Peter Martyr has already received an axe to his skull, and his killer, Carino, stabs him with a dagger. The horrible murder transpires on a beautiful summer day as the sun shines from behind a copse of trees, creating a rhythm of dark bands and glimmering light. This thicket that breaks up the summer sun is a marvelous invention. Was the 80-year-old Giovanni Bellini yet again inspired by a drawing in Jacopo's London book? Perhaps. To conclude, Giovanni Bellini, despite his growing renown and advancing age, continued to be inspired throughout his career by Jacopo's drawing books. Jacopo's drawings, perhaps created principally for practical workshop use, significantly shaped Giovanni's creative approach and served as touchstones for many of his compositions. The legacy of Jacopo's drawing books lived on through Giovanni's artistry, which carried forward the innovative spirit that defined Jacopo's work. And when Gentile Bellini died in 1507, he bequeathed to Giovanni Jacopo's London drawing book. It is the only known material possession bestowed upon Giovanni by either Jacopo or Gentile. Presumably at that point, of course, the London drawing book's remaining value to Jacopo, then in his 80s, would have been largely sentimental. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Our next speaker this afternoon is Elizabeth Eisenberg. Elizabeth is the Moore Curatorial Fellow in the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York. And Elizabeth received her PhD from New York University's Institute of Fine Arts with a dissertation on the formative influence of Andrea del Verrocchio's sculptural practice on Leonardo da Vinci's drawings and paintings. An article deriving from this research was published in Master Drawings in 2019 and was awarded their first annual Ricciardi Prize for the best article by a young scholar under 40. Elizabeth has worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, both in the drawings and prints and medieval departments, and she's written and published widely on Hebrew illuminated manuscripts for multiple volumes published by the Metropolitan Museum and the Getty. Elizabeth is the 2021 recipient of the Renaissance Society of America's Pedretti Fellowship in Leonardo Studies. And today she's going to speak to us about Verrocchio's Spring, Drinking at Verrocchio's Spring, Leonardo's response to Verrocchio's investigative training practices. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth.
Thank you, Aoife, and thank you, Michelle and Lydia and Michael for inviting me here today. Those of you who visited the Verrocchio exhibitions in 2018 and 2019 at Palazzo Strozzi and at the National Gallery of Art, or even the first gallery of the Louvre's 2019 Leonardo show, have seen for yourselves what his contemporaries described in prose and verse, that the master sculptor painter was an exceptional and generous teacher that, as Ugolino Verrino wrote, whatever painters have that is good, they drink from Verrocchio's spring, end quote. And as Giovanni Santi wrote, Verrocchio was a fountain and a bridge to painting and sculpture. In his own artistic investigations and in his training of others, Verrocchio was also a bridge between pictorial and sculptural art, referencing each to achieve naturalism in the other. Verrocchio was distinguished for his ability to capture a sense of vitality, of realistic expression, of movement, and of atmospheric phenomena in his sculptures. He pursued these same aims in his painting through intense investigation of sculptural form. More than any other artist who passed through the workshop, Leonardo was aligned with Verrocchio in his profound curiosity regarding optical phenomena, desire to tackle new challenges, and investigative mode of problem solving. It was Leonardo, therefore, who best internalized Verrocchio's experiments and teachings and then also developed them further. The third gallery of the 2019 exhibition, Verrocchio, Master of Leonardo, at Palazzo Strozzi, provides perhaps the best modern approximation of what it might have been like to actually stand in Verrocchio's workshop surrounded by its artworks. Madonna and Child compositions rendered in tempera, oil, terracotta, and marble line the walls, together with pricked cartoons and drawings that documented sculptural models. Among the painted compositions was Verrocchio's Madonna and Child from Berlin, in which the artist captured a number of impressive effects of illumination, including the reflected light on the underside of the Madonna's jaw. Verrocchio's handling of this area, it is both subtly and sublimely masterful, but it is interesting to note that each of the paintings that hung in that gallery exhibits a similar treatment, perhaps executed with a greater or lesser degree of finesse, with alternating bands of light and shadow modeling the jaw. I am purposely not specifying which artwork is by which follower or collaborator, as attribution seems besides the point here. That Verrocchio instructed those in his workshop in how to convincingly define the jaw through the portrayal of both direct and reflected light and shadow appears to go without saying. The more interesting question is how Verrocchio might have done so. Study of Verrocchio's artworks and apprentices reveal that among his strengths were both his ability to capture and convey the experience of the world around him and his propensity for teaching his students artistic reasoning rather than straight mechanics. The profusion of drapery studies, which we looked at before, associated with his workshop, confirms that he directed controlled observational studies of atmospheric effects, such as light, through the careful use of three-dimensional aids. He devised his original technique of executing these studies in brush on linen to better convey the sense of reflected light via the soft subtlety afforded by these materials, and he passed that well-tuned awareness on to his students. An artist and educator with that modus operandi would not have simply dictated a theoretical academic formula for his students to follow, such as, for the jaw, paint a stripe of light, a stripe of shadow, and a stripe of light. Surrounded by multimedia artworks, Verrocchio likely instead turned to a sculptural relief like the Santa Maria Nuova Madonna and Child, pointed to the observable play of light on the three-dimensional form and said, "You see that? See how the light hits the cheek and then disappears into shadow before effervescing back into a glow? Do that." In Verrocchio's workshop, the experiential trumped the academic precisely because the sculptural, painted, and graphic media were intrinsically intertwined in service to each other. This cross-pollination of media and investigative mode of teaching were foundational to Leonardo's artistic education and many of his future artistic practices. Leonardo internalized the habits of study and motifs that he learned in Verrocchio's workshop, and then used them as the starting points for the development of his own original aims and artistic practices, such as the juxtaposition of types, the outward portrayal of inner state, or what Leonardo called i moti mentali, the creative process of moving from model to inspired form, the drawing of multiple possibilities out of individual models, and the study of what would become sfumato. I've mentioned elsewhere, and I'll just review here, how Verrocchio's bust of a man is notable not only as a beautifully crafted and emotive bust, albeit here with an overemphasized repaired chin, that was not original, but also for how it illustrates a deliberate artistic practice in which Verrocchio first referenced three-dimensional models to capture the correct physiognomic anatomy, upon which he could then mold the flesh at will to change that form into numerous figures. Here you see how the bust is the basis for both an aged Saint Jerome above and a younger Saint John the Baptist below. On a sheet in Edinburgh, a single pose by a Garzone yielded 3 studies of the young man and 1 transformation in which the artist used the Garzone's physiognomy as foundational scaffolding and then advanced his age through the sinking of the cheeks, the growth of the beard, and the shifting of his gaze, transforming the youth into a grizzled old man. The multi-figure sheet essentially freeze frames the process employed by Verrocchio to turn his sculpted bust of an elderly man into his painterly youthful Baptist, clarifying a workshop practice in which he secured the model's physiognomic anatomy before using his imagination to transform its identity by either advancing or reversing the aging process. Leonardo internalized this practice, as can be seen in the examples of the screaming head for the Battle of Anghiari, for which Leonardo seems to have used the same three-dimensional model for the older head to create the younger figure, capturing the facial structure from another viewpoint before smoothing out the wrinkles. It also appears that the practice of aging a figure up or down, or of conceiving figures of contrasting ages, encouraged Leonardo to ruminate on this type of juxtaposition, feeding his long-standing interest in juxtaposed profiles and types. The humanity that Verrocchio achieved in his bust also influenced Leonardo directly as well, and it served as a model for the most emotive figure in the whole of that Adoration of Magi, which was painted in Florence on the right, as well as for Leonardo's own St. Jerome painted in Milan on the left. This latter figure is touted as the embodiment of Leonardo's absorption in both the formulation of the moti mentali and the location of the seat of the soul, but much of the figure's emotion essentially derives from Verrocchio's bust, suggesting again that even the most cerebral of Leonardo's artistic pursuits were born of his training with Verrocchio. Another time, I'd love to discuss with all of you a sculptural connection to Leonardo's Virgin of the Rocks and how Leonardo mediated that connection through drawing. I propose that the multi-step artistic process that Leonardo recommends to artists in his treatise on painting of inspiration, adjustment, life study, and idealization has its origins in the investigations of Verrocchio's workshop, which Leonardo then advanced and codified. But today, I'd like us to look at Leonardo's St. Anne, the development of which is a matter of great debate and involves a tangle of exploratory drawings, preparatory material, and varying compositions. The long artistic process begins with a large cartoon described in a famous letter written by Fra Pietro Novellara to Isabella d'Este in 1501. Novellara described a doctrinally somber composition in which the Virgin Mary tries to stop her son from embracing a lamb, the sacrificial symbol of the Passion, while St. Anne, symbolizing the Church, attempts to keep her daughter from carrying out this separation. This composition is believed to be recorded in painted copies attributed to the Brescianino brothers, which portray the woman's serious expressions and Anne's restraining hand described by Novellara. The next large-scale work related to the theme is the Burlington House cartoon in the National Gallery, London, datable to circa 1505-1508 on stylistic grounds. Here, Leonardo broke from the traditional Florentine St. Anne Materza convention of stacking the three intergenerational family members on each other's laps. Instead, Leonardo interwove the figures in a warm naturalism and placed mother and daughter on the same level. The existence of a third cartoon is known through its implementation on the Louvre panel, which was begun around 1507 to 1508, on which transfer marks can be discerned through technical analysis. It is also known through a contemporary copy of that cartoon, lost in World War II, but preserved in photographs seen here on the right. The Resta Esterhazy cartoon, as the copy is known, may have been made in Leonardo's own Milanese workshop. In this composition, Leonardo here seems to have returned to his earlier conception, although he flipped the figures towards the viewer's right. He also softened the emotional atmosphere of the scene. What Novellara had described as a doctrinally somber composition becomes something less fraught, with both women now wearing soft smiles, their urgency ameliorated. The compositions of the Novellara and Resta Esterhazy cartoon are clearly related, though reversed, but the London cartoon stands out. The great differences between that composition and the others have led scholars to question whether it was even conceived as part of the development of the same commission that yielded the Louvre St. Anne painting. While there is no definitive documentation linking the London cartoon to the panel's commission, which itself is undocumented, I submit that the cartoon and painting do share a continuity of fundamental form and composition. This continuity can be clarified by considering the artistic practices that Leonardo absorbed in Verrocchio's workshop. In studying the London cartoon and the Louvre painting, we find a consistent formal rhythm in the woman's lower bodies, even as Leonardo transposed which limbs belong to whom. The overall composition and poses have changed, yet the underlying forms that comprise those shapes have not. Looking at the London cartoon and the Paris painting, there we are, here represented by the Resta Esterhazy cartoon in the interest of comparing tonal, like to like, we notice that Anne's raised left knee now belongs to the Virgin. The puddled drapery marking her left foot becomes the Virgin's right foot. The Virgin's raised left leg and its attendant drapery right here, are simply lowered to become Anne's, and her right foot, leg and foot remain in place and simply shift into Anne's ownership. Even the pattern of light and shadow in the unfinished cartoon is retained. The Virgin's shaded right foot and Anne's bright right foot, left in stark silhouette, are translated in the third cartoon into Anne's left and right foot, one in shadow, one illuminated by bright sunlight. The lighter tone of Anne's drapery-covered left foot becomes the brightness of the Virgin's right, and the glowing highlight on the Virgin's left knee is maintained and translated in the Resta Esterhazy cartoon onto her extended right thigh. Although Leonardo dramatically altered the woman's positions from one composition to the next, he preserved the underlying structural rhythm of this design, even as he molded new poses around it. While this retention and reuse of form underlines Leonardo's creative ability to see the manifold possibilities latent in every object, it also reiterates Leonardo's absorption of the practices of Verrocchio's workshop. We know that the shop was populated with plaster hands and feet, clay busts and babies, slip-hardened drapery models, and drawings. And I can get my cursor back here. Among these are a number of pricked cartoons of beautiful heads that do not seem to have been directly applied in any known surviving paintings. Verrocchio's cartoon for the head of an angel at the center displays Verrocchio's graphic sfumato in its sensitive handling of light that speaks to the study of a three-dimensional model. Black chalk in the pricked holes reveals that the drawing was transferred in some capacity, perhaps to another sheet of paper, and heavy wear across the drawing surface indicates that it was much referenced in the workshop. The congruences between this head, the angel on the right in the baptism, and the archangel in the Tobias and Raphael have been recognized, as has the fact that the cartoon is too large in scale to have been used for direct transfer in either of those projects. Instead, it seems that Verrocchio mentally registered and reused the desirable underlying structure of the head, flipping it to face the other way, raising and lowering the eyes as needed, and combining its form with others in different contexts. Verrocchio retained the formal rhythm of this angled and downturned head for figures other than angels as well. The parallels between this head and those in the head of a woman in the British Museum and Venus and Cupid in the Uffizi are striking. It has been noticed that the metal points head on the recto of another sheet in the Uffizi is a drawing after the head of an angel at center, but the study of a child's head on that sheet's verso also displays a very similar angling of the head in all planes with the addition of childish chubby cheeks. The retention and recombination of this essential form relates back to Verrocchio's use of sculpture in the workshop. The delicate calibration of light and shadow on the faces of the Uffizi angel and the British Museum woman suggests that Verrocchio created those drawings via examination of a sculptural model, as he did his drapery studies. Having studied the essential volumetric form, he could then reuse it in other drawings and paintings. This cross-media approach is supported by the noted similarity of the head type to Verrocchio's terracotta sleeping youth, although it is likely that both stemmed from an additional Ur model. Similarly, scholars have noted parallels between the extended arms of Verrocchio's fresco Jerome Pistoia, his Baptist in the Uffizi, and the executioner in the beheading of the Baptist relief. Those similarities exist not because the arms were all slavishly copied from the same model, but likely because they were all investigated from the same sculptural study of how a sinewy muscled arm and hand should work. Verrocchio's clay and terracotta models promoted analysis of the descriptive and veristic effects of light and movement. The plaster casts and sculptural models Verrocchio created allowed him to understand forms and figural rhythms and then recombine them in different contexts. He used these tools to devise solutions to artistic problems and then referenced these good solutions as needed. It seems that Leonardo learned from this training to retain and reuse the underlying forms of compelling figural arrangement, even as the other elements of a composition changed. Additionally, scholars have proposed the possibility that Verrocchio deliberately employed this technique of transposing limbs when designing a Tobias and the Angel composition of circa 1470 to 72, meant to rival the one painted by Piero del Pollaiolo a number of years earlier, and that's Pollaiolo on the left. Rather than taking a complete departure from Pollaiolo's composition in order to best it, Verrocchio corrected it by retaining the poses of the legs, but swapping them between the figures to create a more naturally energetic composition. Pollaiolo had positioned Raphael with his legs spread firm and wide, halting even the forward motion of Tobias's gait behind him. By exchanging the figures' lower bodies and leading with the strong diagonal of Raphael's left leg, Verrocchio allowed the angel to stride forth off the panel with Tobias in tow. Likewise, while injecting more motion into his scene, Leonardo maintained the apparently satisfactory formal rhythm of the figure's legs in the London cartoon, and reworked them into the new Louvre composition, exchanging which figure they belonged to as necessary. That Leonardo here deliberately employed the practice of retaining form while swapping limbs is corroborated by its documented use even earlier in the St. Anne process. A sheet in the British Museum is preparatory to the London cartoon. The central study has been so densely worked that Leonardo reinforced its finalized contours with a stylus to transfer a legible tracing of the group onto the sheet's verso, which you see at right. The design on the recto closely informed the London cartoon, but as has been observed, the reverse group on the verso also inspired further St. Anne configurations, namely a study for the Virgin and Child with St. Anne in the Louvre on the right. Leonardo retained much of the composition found on the British Museum verso, from the general orientation and pyramidal organization of the three central figures to the positions of each of their lower limbs, with the Virgin's legs draped over her mother's lap. Leonardo seems to have exchanged the positions of the heads of the Christ child and the leftmost female, so that instead of depicting the confrontation between mother and daughter, he focused on the engagement between grandmother and grandson. As pointed out by Heidenreich, the most drastic change to the two female figures is Leonardo's reassignment of the head, torso, and cocked left elbow on the right edge of the composition, which belonged to the Virgin in the British Museum verso, to St. Anne in the Paris drawing. By exchanging the possession of these body parts rather than reshaping them, Leonardo retained the formal rhythm along the right contour of his British Museum figure group while developing St. Anne into more than just a floating head and lessening the tortuous torque between the upper and lower body of the Virgin. This is not a simple reuse of familiar forms, but a deliberate retention and reassignment of configured limbs from one composition in another to maintain core formal rhythms that Leonardo evidently deemed essential. He ultimately carried that bent arm of the Virgin on the British Museum verso through to the Louvre sheet St. Anne and onto the painted panel. Leonardo employed this compositional technique while advancing from the British Museum St. Anne study to that in the Louvre, and appears to have done so again when moving from the London cartoon to the one that informed the Paris painting. This sequential development speaks to one of Leonardo's key artistic directives prescribed in his Trattato, which was not to be precious with one's drawings nor overly concerned about one's contours, but to continue adjusting and layering solutions on top of each other until one has arrived at a satisfying composition. The graphic tempest that is the British Museum St. Anne study is recognized as the ultimate embodiment of this strategy, and another expression of it can be found in the multiple and morphing heads in a study on the same theme in the Accademia of Venice. The development between the British Museum and Louvre drawings and the London and final cartoons can be thought of as a freeze-framed, multi-sheet illustration of that same injunction to remain unattached to one's contours and to instead keep generating multiple solutions and limbs until the ideal composition is achieved. The way in which Leonardo experiments in the cartoons themselves with small shifts to the legs and feet and to whom those limbs belong seems like a continuation of that process, albeit with its successive stages spliced apart on separate sheets of paper. This practice of drawing multiple possibilities of a form on a single sheet of paper was one that Leonardo learned from Verrocchio. One has only to think of Verrocchio's exploratory Louvre sheet of a child twisting every which way to find the seed for the creation of Leonardo's studies for the Madonna of the Cat. In Milan, Leonardo was working on sculpture as well as painting, and like Verrocchio, was engaging with both the reception and conception of form from all angles. Leonardo advanced that practice by drawing those forms directly on top of each other, but the origins of the practice lie in his training with Verrocchio, with the master painter-sculptor. To close, I'd like to propose a connection between Leonardo's St. Anne and not only Verrocchio's artistic practice, but also his actual sculpture, the terracotta angels in the Louvre. Get this back. Okay. Several scholars have named Donatello's Madonna of the Clouds as a direct model for Leonardo's Virgin in the St. Anne. The whereabouts of this relief during Leonardo's time in Florence are unknown, however, and the apparent similarities between Donatello's relief and Leonardo's painting dissipates the more closely one looks. The comparison between the two artworks primarily rests on the parallels between the extended and slightly bent near legs and arms of both Donatello's and Leonardo's Virgins, yet these elements are only superficially similar. Crucially, Leonardo had already explored the Virgin's exact lower body pose decades earlier on a sheet of studies for the Uffizi Adoration of the Magi drawn during his first Florentine period that is unrelated to Donatello. Here, in a quick pen sketch of circa 1480 to 82, Leonardo had already contemplated the pose of a seated figure with an outstretched near leg and a bent far one, an arm extended and a mantle pulled behind. When reversed, this exact pose is deployed in both the contemporaneous Benoit Madonna, as can be seen more clearly in the infrared reflectogram, and in the later Saint Anne Virgin. It is worth noting that similar poses with the legs transposed, the near leg bent and the far leg straight, can be spied in Leonardo's study of a maiden with a unicorn at the Ashmolean, an adoration study in Hamburg, and the allegory with the solar mirror in the Louvre, again supporting the principle that Leonardo retained and revisited figural rhythms that appeal to him. This lower body pose is therefore one that Leonardo had been consistently utilizing since circa 1480 in forms that are clearly independent of Donatello's Madonna of the Clouds. It appears that when devising the configuration of the Virgin's lower body in the Saint Anne, Leonardo mined his own artistic repertoire rather than Donatello's. I propose that Leonardo did have a sculptural exemplar in mind when conceiving of the Virgin in the Saint Anne, which was Verrocchio's left tears angel. Inspired by its calm serenity, elegant motion, and touching tenderness, Leonardo recalled Verrocchio's terracotta angel when called upon to compose an equally celestially serene figure. In his painted Virgin, Leonardo echoed the angel's forward-striving torso, its three-quarter orientation that opens its face and body to the viewer, the angles and extensions of its arm, neck, and head, and its tender expression. The Virgin's smile has often been linked to Leonardo's ideal of grace, and it appears that Leonardo derived the Florentine naturalism and humanity noted by scholars not only from Donatello, but also from Verrocchio, whose studio generated a steady production of tender Madonna and Child compositions in both sculpture and paint. This connection speaks to Leonardo's smooth blending of the lights and shadows in the Metropolitan Museum's study for the head of the Virgin. The almost stroke-free handling recalls, doubtless through intermediary drawings, Leonardo's early experience of a sculptural model made of smooth, solid, unpainted terracotta whose indicators of form are light and shadow rather than line. This recollection was a perfect outlet for Leonardo's prescribed technique to seamlessly blend drawings, quote, in the manner of smoke. I propose that Leonardo's early study of the optical and atmospheric effects that would ultimately coalesce in his technique of sfumato focused not only on his general observation of the natural world, but also on his specific observation of the sculpture he encountered in Verrocchio's workshop, and on Verrocchio's training in how to contemplate and translate the chiaroscuro of sculptural form in drawing and painting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Our third and final speaker for this afternoon's session is Rossella Monopoli. Rossella is and I may remind you that there is no microphone up here, so please, if you wouldn't mind, it's much easier for our speakers to project when the audience is quiet. Rossella is a PhD candidate at the Warburg Institute, and her research there focuses on art patronage in L'Aquila in the late 15th century to the early 16th century, and its relationship with workshop or operation, style, and technique. Rossella worked in 2019 to 20 for the Italian Ministry of Culture on a campaign of research and cataloguing of works of art located in ecclesiastical buildings that were damaged by the 2009 earthquake and recently restored. And Rossella has just completed a fellowship at the Biblioteca Tiziana in Rome, while she's also held fellowships in the Kunsthistorisch Institute in Florence and the Fondazione di Studi di Storia dell'Arte Roberto Longhi in Florence. And today, Rossella is going to speak to us on a paper entitled The Multimedia Workshop of Saturnino Gatti in L'Aquila, Considerations of Unifying Means of Disegno. Thank you, Rossella.
So thank you, Aoife, and good afternoon, everyone. Before starting, I just want to thank Michelle, Lydia, and Michael for organizing such a stimulating conference and giving me the opportunity to take part in it. Today, I'm going to discuss Saturnino Gatti, an artist probably little known to most of you. However, he was one of the main multimedia artists of the Renaissance L'Aquila, an area where the artists commonly produced fresco and panel paintings and also worked terracotta and wood sculptures in a single business. In particular, I propose to consider Saturnino's practice of drawing and to make two connected arguments. I want to show that design was a fundamental linking element in his multimedia practice, while refining ideas about his training, and to discuss the attribution of two drawings in order to show his use of design as unifying force. The question of the Saturnino's possible training is crucial. Although he was noted in a 17th century local chronicle as a pupil of Pietro Perugino, critics today agree that he received his initial training with Silvestro dell'Aquila, the greatest artist of the time in the city, son of the famous goldsmith Giacopo di Sulmona, and documented as painter, sculptor, and architect. This is supported by the document noting that Saturnino witnessed Silvestro's contract for the important project of the tomb of the Cardinal Amico Agnifili in 1477. Saturnino was 14 years old and evidently one of Silvestro's apprentices. However, from the following year until 1488, there is a gap in the documentation about Saturnino. It is during this decade that critics believe he underwent a second period of training, probably in Florence, in contact with the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. This proposal by Alessandro Angelini explicitly dismissed the idea that Saturnino trained with Perugino and has been discussed through stylistic comparisons, of which I gave some very brief examples. Angelini suggested, for example, that in the Resurrection by Saturnino and Tornimparte, the general composition is reminiscent of the Verrocchio's terracotta sculpture dated between 1470 and 1480, now at the Bargello. The gestures and the tense physiognomies of the soldiers are reminiscent of Andrea's figures and also recall Leonardo's studies. The angels on the sarcophagus remind the ones of the Forteguerri monument in Pistoia for their pose and in the hammered folds of their clothing, which look like the work of a goldsmith. Or here again in Torrimparte, where the Christ closely recalls the one of the Incredulity of St. Thomas, with its damp, curly hair framing the face, a dry physiognomy, and a forked bird. The last example with the Madonna of Collemaggio by Saturnino shows the use of the very popular model of the Puzzo in torsion from the Verrocchio's workshop. Given this, I believe that the idea that Saturnino had contact with Perugino is not entirely incorrect, and his production shows not only several connections with Verrocchio's design of the 1470s, but also with Perugino's designs of the late 1470s, early 1480s. While the Peruginism of Saturnino requires more extensive analysis than this, and so must be postponed to another occasion, a reflection on the general cultural horizon of Saturnino's art is important for understanding the complexity of his work and for providing valuable insight into his method of study and assimilation of the artistic practice. Documented works by Saturnino produced in different media share a common approach to the study of anatomy and volume, resulting in a similar stylistic expression that make them recognizable as works by the same author. A clear example in this sense is a sculptural group with the Pietà that Saturnino created at the end of his career for the Cathedral of Ascoli Piceno, in comparison with the painted group with the same subject that is part of the early 1490s scene of the cycle of San Panfilo and Tornimparte. The arrangement of the composition, the style of anatomical representation, the details in the definition of the faces of Christ and the Madonna are almost identical in the two works. These kinds of comparisons lead me to believe that even if no drawings by Saturnino's hand are yet known with certainty, the basis of his artistic practice as a painter and sculptor was grounded on a meticulous study of the human figure through the use of drawing, considered by Vasari as the head of everything. While this may seem obvious, it is an aspect of production that should not be taken for granted, as for example, such method does not apply the better-known multimedia artist Becchietta, whose production does not show connections between his paintings and his sculptures. To work more fully on the question of Saturnino and Disegno, it is necessary to have a better sense of which drawings are by the artist, a search complicated by the specific situation in the Aquilan context. This geographical area has not only been plagued by material loss and dispersion of objects and documents due to the earthquakes it has suffered over centuries, but also by long-standing historiographical biases stemming from Giorgio Vasari's aversion to the south of Italy. This resulted in the poor representation of the artist from L'Aquila in his lives and was followed by a long history of neglect within the main art historical narrative. In this general context, undocumented works of art, including drawings, often get attached to well-known names, but they don't always belong to them. For this reason, I'm going to discuss attribution issues, as identifying drawings is fundamental to the analysis of Saturnino's workshop process. In particular, I will discuss a relatively recently discovered fresco and two long debated drawings, one from the Uffizi and the other from the Windsor Library, reopening the debate on their attribution in order to reconsider the working methods of Saturnino Gatti. The Uffizi sheet depicts an elderly standing saint, identified as Joseph, with his hands clasped together and resting on a long staff. The figure is set in a slightly outlined rocky landscape. This drawing has been extensively studied and has been attributed to several different artists. Leaving aside the less reliable attributions to Cosimo Rosselli and Luca Signorelli, it has been framed since the 1920s in the Umbrian Tuscan culture of the early 1480s and commonly given first to Fiorenzo di Lorenzo and then to Pietro Perugino. The attribution to Perugino is the most reliable and has been proposed by several scholars over time, even if with a certain caution, and recently in 2019, this has been sustained by Francesco Cagliotti and Andrea De Marchi, as referred by Roberta Liventi in her catalogue record of the Verrocchio exhibition. In the record, Aliventi concurs that no works by Perugino can be directly traced back to the drawing, but notes that it could be considered a reference for some figures in Perugino's paintings, as for the Saint Joseph in the altarpiece of the Adoration of the Magi for the Church of Santa Maria dei Servi, variously dated between 1473-78. In my opinion, the similarities in this case are of a typological nature, but they are not strong enough to speak of an identity of hand. Rather, I would like to propose that both the figures, the one in the drawing and the one in the painting, might have been inspired by a lost drawing by Perugino. Moreover, I think that the stylistic characteristics of the drawing I'm showing you provide decisive insights for its connection to the hand of Saturnino Gatti, an artist never considered as the author of the work in the debate so far. The drawing shows the artist's interest in setting the figure in space and giving it three-dimensionality through the meticulous study of drapery and the contrast between light and shadow. Particularly noteworthy is the psychological investigation of the saint's face, which reveals an attention to the rendering of effects that seems to go beyond Perugino's interest and achievements in this aspect. However, these are all characteristics that can be traced in the production of Saturnino Gatti. The fresco of the Adoration of the Shepherds, Adoration of the Shepherds, yes, found after the 2009 earthquake in the Church of San Pietro in Coppito, the town in the Aquilan Contado, clearly suggests a close connection to the Uffizi sheet. The comparison of the fresco and the drawing offers an interesting starting point for broadening the cultural horizon of the drawing and reopening the debate on its attribution. The whole composition and the general arrangement of the figures in space are details that bring the two works very close together and lead me to suggest that they were painted by the same hand. Particularly significant is the quite perfect match in the representation of the hands, which are overlapping and resting on the staff, an anatomical detail of absolute importance given the difficulty of execution that the reproduction of this part of the body notoriously presents. The head of the figure is a particularly noteworthy detail that, beyond the similarity with the fresco, especially finds its three-dimensional translation in two documented terracotta sculptures by Saturnino, the Saint Anthony, the Abbot in the Museo Nazionale d'Abruzzo, and the Saint Benedict of Amatrice. Given the affinity between the two sculptured heads, I will refer only to the St. Anthony for the comparison. Seen from the left profile, its affinity with the drawing is striking. The two figures are closely linked by the volumetric quality of the head with its rounded, convex forehead, and by the rendering of the wrinkles on the neck and at the base of the temple. The melancholic and pensive expression, with the half-closed eyes and the low stare, suggests a strong interest in the psychological introspection and make them deeply individualized, quite far from the more stereotyped Perugino Saint Joseph. I propose that both the heads discussed connects to Saturnino's study of human figure and anatomy, and that they were made mindful of Verrocchio's and Leonardo's practice of the study of heads. Although possibly inspired by a lost model by Perugino, this drawing seems to me the result of a complex method of operation aimed at understanding from within the linguistic canon of its masters of reference, namely Perugino and Verrocchio, and at reinterpreting common ideas of human figure and draperies according to a personal creative flair. To better reflect on the connections of Saturnino with the work of Perugino and with the Uffizi drawing, I would like to focus for a moment on the scene of the delivery of keys in the Sistine Chapel, considered to have been painted by Perugino himself, but which has never been called upon in connection with our Uffizi drawing. It seems to me that some figures in the foreground look like the visual source of some solutions concerning drapery and the setting of figures in the space that we see both in the Uffizi drawing and in the painting of San Pietro in Coppito. The clock of the saint in the drawing recalls more closely the one of the Saint Simon in the Sistine Chapel, while the robe of the Saint of Coppito could be inspired by the Vatican Christ with a similar flap towards the arched edge, or even more closely to the purple cloak of the saint standing behind Simon. The posture of the saint in Coppito, although his right foot is lost, also closely recalls the poses of the foreground figures in the Vatican scene, with one foot set firmly on the ground and the other foreshortened and resting on the tip. Other similarities between the Coppito fresco and the Uffizi drawing can be found in the definition of the volumes, in the dense texture of the white lead hatching, which effectively creates a luminous and three-dimensional effect, and again, in the very similar representation of the overlapping hands. These are extremely realistically defined, soft and fleshy, volumetric, and perfectly foreshortened. This last element is not to be found in the pictorial examples of Perugino, to which the critics have referred the drawing. And this is a key point, as Perugino attend to hands in a more, allow me this brutal word, more rigid way, as we can see also in these hand studies at the Ashmolean Museum. The second drawing I would like to briefly discuss is the female figure in a rocky background from the Royal Collection in Windsor. In this case, too, the attributions have been numerous and included the young Perugino. Only recently, the name of Saturnino Gatti has been suggested by Ferdinando Bologna, albeit without strong enough arguments. While the almost identical representation of this figure in some paintings by Giovanni Santi has clouded the issue of authorship, leading many scholars to attribute the drawing to the father of Raphael, Gigetta Dalliregoli has convincingly debunked the idea, noting that Santi made a practice of quoting figures from other painters. Indeed, Dalliregoli points out the similarities in the representation of the drapery between the drawing in question and, I quote, a study of an old man attributed to Perugino or Fiorenzo di Lorenzo, a drawing perhaps used by Giovanni Santi himself with variations in the setting in the Visitation in Fano, end of quote. This is precisely our Uffizi drawing. Stylistic features suggest that the Windsor drawing is incompatible with the hands of Santi. Instead, as noted by Bologna, it is likely to be by Saturnino. This is, for example, because the face of the female figure in the drawing shows interesting similarities with the rendering of some faces in the Torre in Parte cycle, and with the face of the Virgin in the fresco now in the Church of Santa Margherita in L'Aquila, this one commonly understood to be by Saturnino. The similarity in the representation of the oval shape, the definition of the pointed chin characterized by a dimple under the small and fleshy lips, in the eyebrows defined by two curved lines starting from the straight and long nose, the latter ending at the bottom in a base that returns almost identically in all four examples, seem to me quite striking. The rendering of the eyes and the strong neck are other features that connect the figures in question, as well as the pose and the stubby feet, which closely recall the figure of the Blessed Vincenzo by Saturnino. Finally, the crumpled drapery, which seems in its jagged folds to be the work of a goldsmith, is comparable to the flattering linen cloth of Christ in the resurrection of Don in Parte, and with the St. Joseph's garments in the Uffizi drawing. In conclusion, I believe that there is a strong case for finally distancing the two drawings discussed here from the orthography of Perugino and for attributing them to Saturnino Gatti, a relatively little studied artist from Abruzzo. As the comparison I have discussed suggests, Saturnino had a much closer and more direct relationship with the cultural milieu already unfittingly attributed to the drawings than it has hitherto been assumed. The analysis of the works presented here makes it further possible to posit a strong link with the Perugino of the late 1470s, early 1480s, that is, around the time of the prestigious Vatican enterprise, without rejecting the hypothesis of Saturnino's Florentine education in Verrocchio's workshop. The two sheets could be the first and most important visual documents yet known for reflecting on and understanding Saturnino Gatti's working methods during the various stages of his career. They summarize several of the typical elements of Saturnino's painted and sculpted art. Given these, they support an understanding of his practice based on the imitation and representation of his models across media, as the foundation and unifying elements of his artistic method, both in painting and in sculpture. Thank you.